Princes of the Yen.
日元的王子
Comments on the Japanese edition of Princes of the Yen.
关于日元的王子们日本版的评论。
A powerful work.
一部强大的作品。
Isaac Sakakibara, ex-Vice Minister of Finance.
神原英姿前财务省副大臣。
Weekly Economist, Tokyo.
东京周刊经济学家。
This is no ordinary economics book. Readers will find the curtains pulled away from their eyes. Given the timescale covered, the whole of the 20th century, in its broad scope, looking at central bankers' actions worldwide, this superb book will make you marvel at how fascinating economics really is. Richard Werner could see through the Bank of Japan smokescreens. The process of disclosing all these facts step by step is as gripping as a thriller. His analysis has been highly appraised internationally, being prominently covered in The Economist and read by Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan.
这不是一本普通的经济学书籍，读者会发现他们的视野被揭开。考虑到所涵盖的时间范围，整个20世纪以及其广泛的范围，观察全球中央银行家的行动，这本出色的书会让你惊叹于经济学的真正迷人之处。理查德·沃纳能看穿日本银行的烟幕，逐步揭示所有这些事实的过程，就像一部惊心动魄的惊悚片。他的分析在国际上得到了高度评价，被《经济学人》突出报道，并被美联储主席艾伦·格林斯潘阅读。
Takashi Tachibana, author of Shuken Bunzan.
立花龙周刊文春的作者。
This thought-provoking book sheds light on the masterminds of Japan's economic policies. The author gives stunning accounts of how a handful of the Bojei's elite distorted the nation's financial policies with a view to reforming the country's economic structure.
这本发人深省的书揭示了日本经济政策的幕后策划者。作者生动地描述了日本银行的少数精英如何扭曲国家的金融政策，以期改革国家的经济结构。
The Asahi Shimbun, Tokyo.
朝日新闻，东京。
The book deals not just with economic problems, but also unmasks the true causes and power brokers behind those very problems. It depicts the BOJ Prince's clandestine battle to revive the American-style liberalized economy as it existed in the Japan of the 1920s and to dismantle the controlled war economy, which enabled the post-war high growth.
这本书不仅探讨了经济问题，还揭示了这些问题背后的真正原因和操纵者。它描绘了日本银行的王子们秘密地努力复兴1920年代日本的美式自由化经济，并试图拆除控制战争经济，这使得战后的高速增长成为可能。
The Mainichi Newspaper, Tokyo.
每日新闻，东京。
This book makes for a fascinating read. Werner says the claims by the BOJ that they are doing all they can to stimulate a recovery by lowering interest rates are just not true. He goes as far as including a mafia-like list of names and provides evidence about how Sasaki, Maekawa, Mino, and soon-to-be-installed Toshihiko Fukui have in an unbroken line been trying to control Japan. I first met the author of this thought-provoking book 11 years ago. He already was a famously accurate strategist, using his analysis to forecast stock market movements with a high degree of precision.
这本书非常引人入胜。温纳尔说，日本银行声称他们正在尽其所能通过降低利率来刺激经济复苏，这完全不是事实。他甚至列出了一份类似黑帮的名单，并提供了关于佐佐木、前川、三重野和即将上任的福井俊彦如何一直试图控制日本的证据。我在11年前首次遇见这本书的作者，他已经是一位非常准确的策略家，用他的分析预测股市动态，准确度极高。
Kiyoshi Imai, Professor of Economics, Tokyo.
金景清，经济学教授，东京。
Legitimate criticism of the Bank of Japan.
对日本银行的合理批评。
Kazuo Igiri, Voice, Tokyo.
医治河南，声音，东京。
We are all baffled at why on earth Japan's recession has continued for over 10 years. Countless scholars have come and gone explaining the causes and remedies for the recession. We should seriously heed this author's warnings.
我们都对日本的经济衰退为何会持续超过10年感到困惑。无数的学者们来了又去，解释这次衰退的原因和解决办法。我们应该认真听取这位作者的警告。
Yoichi Masuzo, member of the House of Councilors.
增田洋一，参议院议员。
Preface.
序言。
In January 2001, the ambassador to Japan of a European country told me about his recent New Year's Eve party at his residence in Tokyo. Among the guests was a high-ranking official from Japan's Ministry of Finance, MAF. Most guests were in a joyful mood. They looked forward to the dawn of the 21st century. Champagne was flowing, and the party was in full swing. But not everyone was happy.
2001年1月，一位欧洲国家的驻日本大使向我讲述了他在东京住所举办的新年夜晚会的近况。在宾客中有一位来自日本财政部 MOF 的高级官员。大多数宾客都心情愉快，他们期待着21世纪的到来。香槟流动，派对如火如荼，但并非所有人都快乐。
I noticed, the ambassador told me, as the clock approached midnight, this gentleman seemed to be getting sadder and sadder. He was from the Ministry of Finance, and he looked really down. I wondered what the problem was. It was most unusual, I thought. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, he came up to me and told me, in a very sad voice.
我注意到，大使告诉我，当时钟接近午夜时，这位绅士似乎变得越来越悲伤。他来自财政部，看起来真的很沮丧。我想知道问题出在哪里。我觉得这真的很不寻常。最后，当时钟敲响午夜时，他走上前来，用非常悲伤的声音告诉我
Now, it's all over.
现在一切都结束了。
What do you mean? I asked him.
你是什么意思？我问他。
We lost our name, he replied. It's over. From January 2001, Okurashio, the Japanese name for Ministry of Finance, is gone.
我们失去了我们的名字，他回答说。一切都结束了。从2001年1月开始，财务省日语中的大藏省已经不存在了。
I tried to console him by saying, well, but it's just the name. You shouldn't worry too much about a name. The ministry is still there. You still have power and influence.
我试图安慰他说，但这只是个名字。你不应该过于担心一个名字。部门还在那里，你还有权力和影响力。
But he said, if they at least had left us the name. They had already taken away our power. It's gone, but that they would also take away our name. He shook his head despondently.
但他说，如果他们至少留给我们名字，他们已经剥夺了我们的权利。一切都结束了，但他们还要剥夺我们的名字。他沮丧地摇了摇头。
Not noticed by many English speakers, to whom the old Okurashio was simply known as the Ministry of Finance, a long and illustrious history ended abruptly in January 2001. For much of the past century, at least according to the letter of the law, the Okurashio had been the most powerful institution in Japan. Its grand old name is more correctly translated as Great Storehouse Ministry or Great Treasury Ministry. And its history goes back to the time when taxes were paid in kind and the ministry literally was the storehouse of the rice that would arrive from all over the country.
许多英语使用者并未注意到这一点，对他们来说，旧的大藏省只是被简单地称为财务省。一个悠久而辉煌的历史在2001年1月突然结束。在过去的大部分世纪里，至少根据法律的字面意义，大藏省一直是日本最强大的机构。它的古老名字更准确地翻译为大仓库部或大财库部，其历史可以追溯到税款以实物支付的时代。那时这个部门实际上就是全国各地送来的稻米的仓库。
Structural change.
结构性变化。
The general public has not shed any tears over the demise of Okurashio. MAF, the finance ministry, is generally held responsible for the most flagrant economic mismanagement in modern peacetime Japanese history, the creation of the bubble of the 1980s and the long recession that followed in the 1990s.
一般公众并未为大藏省的消亡留下任何眼泪。财务省 MOF 通常被认为是现代和平时期日本历史上最明显的经济管理失误的责任方，创造了20世纪80年代的经济泡沫，以及随后在90年代的长期衰退。
The recession had produced the general conviction that Japan's old economic system, headed by its leading bureaucracies, did not work anymore and thus had to be reformed drastically. Most commentators now claim that structural changes are badly needed. Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi's most repeated slogan is "No recovery without structural reform." Senior members of the Japanese central bank have been calling for far-reaching structural reform on an almost daily basis. These voices claim that liberalization, deregulation, and privatization, in other words, the introduction of US-style capitalism, is necessary for Japan's economy to recover.
这场衰退使得人们普遍确信，由其主要官僚机构领导的日本旧经济体系已经不再适用，因此必须进行彻底的改革。现在大多数评论家都声称急需结构性变化。日本首相小泉纯一郎最常重复的口号是没有结构改革就没有复苏。日本中央银行的高级成员几乎每天都在呼吁进行深远的结构改革。这些声音声称自由化、放松管制和私有化，换句话说，引入美国式的资本主义对日本经济的复苏是必要的。
But is it really necessary to abandon Japanese-style capitalism? One would think so, when considering the dismal performance of the economy during the 1990s. But it is strange that Japan's economic system was far more closed, cartelized, and controlled in the 1980s, and yet nobody complained that its economy was growing too slowly then. The same applies to the 1950s or 1960s, when an almost completely cartelized economy delivered double-digit growth. Moreover, the U.S. economy itself still suffers from business cycles and downturns. It seems, then, that the same economic structure can deliver high or low growth, and growth performance depends on other factors as well. This book shows that the Japanese recession was indeed due to the main force driving the business cycle, money. It is not by coincidence that the main proponents of structural change are precisely those who are in control of Japan's money.
但是，真的有必要放弃日本式的资本主义吗？考虑到90年代经济的糟糕表现，人们可能会这么认为。但奇怪的是，日本的经济体系在80年代更为封闭、垄断和受控，然而当时没有人抱怨其经济增长过慢。同样的情况也适用于50年代或60年代，当时几乎完全垄断的经济带来了2位数的增长。此外，美国经济本身仍然受到商业周期和经济衰退的困扰，因此看起来同样的经济结构可以带来高增长或低增长，而增长表现也取决于其他因素。这本书表明，日本的衰退确实是由驱动商业周期的主要力量货币引起的。恰好主张结构性变化的主要支持者就是掌控日本货币的人。
The Defiant Bank of Japan.
日本银行的抗命。
The central bank has consistently defied calls by the government, finance minister, and prime minister to create more money to stimulate the economy and end the long recession. At crucial junctures, such as in 1992, 1993, early 1995, and much of 1999, the Bank of Japan, BOJ, even actively reduced the amount of money circulating in the economy. This shrank purchasing power, reduced domestic demand, rendered the government's currency intervention ineffective, and strengthened the yen, thus aborting emerging recoveries. Lacking sufficiently supportive monetary policies, the government had to rely on fiscal policies. Those were not effective, and instead produced the largest national debt mountain of any industrialized country.
中央银行一直坚决抵制政府、财政部长和首相要求其创造更多货币以刺激经济并结束长期衰退的呼吁。在关键的时刻，如1992年、1993年、1995年初和1999年的大部分时间，日本银行 BOJ 甚至积极减少了经济中流通的货币量。这缩小了购买力，减少了国内需求，使政府的货币干预无效，并强化了日元，从而阻止了新兴的复苏。由于缺乏足够支持的货币政策，政府不得不依赖财政政策。这些政策并未有效，反而产生了工业化国家中最大的国债山。
The big puzzle of the 1990s is just why, despite record unemployment and deflation, the Bank of Japan failed to expand the amount of money further and thus create a recovery, reduce deflation, and stabilize employment. Sometimes fear of inflation is given as the answer. But Japan has witnessed sharp falls in inflation during the first half of the 1990s and outright deflation in the second. When prices rise and there is inflation, we know that monetary policy is too loose and too much money is being created. Then the central bank needs to tighten. When prices fall and there is deflation, the central bank has a duty to create more purchasing power. In general, it is the job of the central bank to create sufficient amounts of money to keep the actual growth rate close to potential and hence avoid both inflation and deflation.
20世纪90年代的一个大难题就是，尽管日本的失业率创历史新高且出现通货紧缩，但日本银行却未能进一步扩大货币供应，从而刺激经济复苏，减少通货紧缩，稳定就业。有时候，人们会将恐惧通胀作为答案，但是日本在90年代上半叶经历了通胀的急剧下降，下半叶则出现了明显的通货紧缩。当价格上涨出现通胀时，我们知道货币政策过于宽松，创造的货币过多。那时，中央银行需要收紧政策。当价格下跌，出现通货紧缩时，中央银行有责任创造更多的购买力。总的来说，中央银行的任务是创造足够的货币，使实际增长率接近潜在增长率，从而避免通胀和通货紧缩。
Given the obvious deflation problem, the Bank of Japan admitted a while ago that fear of inflation is not the reason for its cautious stance. To the contrary, for many years now the Bank of Japan has been saying that it is trying hard to stimulate the economy, noting that it has lowered interest rates to zero. But, it claims, the problem has been a lack of demand for money. Yet it is clear that the largest demand for money in the world is located precisely in Japan. First, the government sector demands record amounts of money to fund its fiscal spending. Second, the many small and medium-sized firms that are Japan's main employers would like to borrow money. But the banks, burdened with bad debts, have only been willing to lend to larger, lower-risk borrowers. That is why the central bank needs to step in and substitute for their lending.
鉴于明显的通货紧缩问题，日本银行不久前承认，恐惧通胀并非其谨慎立场的原因。相反，多年来，日本银行一直表示，它正在努力刺激经济，指出它已经将利率降至0。但是，它声称问题在于对货币的需求不足。然而，很明显，世界上对货币的需求最大的地方正是日本。首先，政府部门需要创纪录的货币来资助其财政支出。其次，日本的主要雇主许多中小企业都希望借款，但是由于负债累累，银行只愿意向风险较小的大型借款人放贷。这就是为什么中央银行需要介入并替代他们的贷款。
Sometimes the Bank of Japan claims that it is already injecting plenty of money into the economy, but it has mostly poured its money into the very narrow money market to which only banks have access. At other times, worries about deflation are countered by its spokesman with the assertion that deflation is due to desirable structural changes and hence good. But if those structural changes have indeed made Japan's economy more productive, this would raise Japan's potential growth rate, leaving an even larger gap with actual growth. In that case, the central bank would have to create even more money to reduce the deflationary gap.
有时，日本银行声称它已经向经济注入了大量的货币，但是它主要是将资金投入到只有银行可以进入的非常狭窄的货币市场。有时，对通货紧缩的担忧被其发言人以通货紧缩是由于有益的结构性变化而产生，因此是好事来反驳。但是，如果这些结构性变化确实使日本经济更具生产力，这将提高日本的潜在增长率，使实际增长与潜在增长之间的差距更大。在这种情况下，中央银行将不得不创造更多的货币来减少通货紧缩的差距。
The most recent argument by central bankers, apparently also backed by the Prime Minister and his Minister of Economic and Fiscal Policy, is that there is too much excess capacity in Japan. This is true, and another way of putting it would be to say that aggregate supply is larger than aggregate demand. But instead of drawing the logical conclusion that demand should be stimulated, which the central bank could easily do, the advice is given to restrict the supply by closing down firms. Reminiscent of the ill-fated policies of certain Depression-era politicians in Japan, Germany, and the United States, this excess capacity is said to result in excess competition, which must be dealt with through bankruptcies. Ironically, this argument is proposed by the very same commentators who also argue that Japan needs more deregulation because it suffers from a lack of competition.
最近，中央银行家们的观点显然也得到了首相和他的经济财政政策部长的支持。他们认为日本存在过多的过剩产能，这是事实。另一种说法是总供应大于总需求，但是 他们并没有得出应该刺激需求的逻辑结论，这是中央银行可以轻易做到的，而是建议通过关闭公司来限制供应。这种过剩产能被认为会导致过度竞争，必须通过破产来处理。讽刺的是，提出这一论点的正是那些也主张日本需要更多的放松管制，因为它存在竞争不足的评论员。
The pattern is clear. While the Bank of Japan's arguments vary and are quickly changed, when countered, they always come to the same conclusion. Namely that the central bank's monetary policy has been appropriate and that the blame lies with Japan's economic structure.
模式很明显，虽然日本银行的论点各不相同，并且在被反驳时会迅速改变，但他们总是得出同样的结论，即中央银行的货币政策是适当的，责任在于日本的经济结构。
The Bank of Japan could have helped, but it didn't.
日本银行本可以提供帮助，但它没有。
Money is normally created by banks. It is precisely because banks did not lend that the central bank needed to inject more money directly into the economy. It would thus act as the banker to the nation, as other central banks have done before, and as, indeed, the Bank of Japan did after 1945, when banks' balance sheets looked far worse than in the 1990s. This worked so well in the years after 1945 that credit growth quickly recovered and the economy boomed. But throughout much of the 1990s, the Bank of Japan failed to take these tested and tried policies and failed to create enough money for a sustained economic recovery. Moreover, it has refused to lend to those who needed money most, the government and the small firms. The Bank of Japan also has had it in its power to delete the entire mountain of bad debts in the banking system without any costs to itself, the taxpayer, or society at large. Yet it chose not to act. Why?
货币通常由银行创造。正因为银行没有贷款，中央银行需要直接向经济注入更多的货币，因此，它将充当国家的银行，就像其他中央银行以前所做的那样。实际上，日本银行在1945年之后也这样做了，当时银行的资产负债表看起来比90年代要糟糕得多。这在1945年之后的几年里效果非常好，信贷增长迅速恢复，经济繁荣。但在大部分90年代，日本银行没有采取这些经过验证和尝试的政策，没有创造足够的货币来实现持续的经济复苏。此外，它拒绝向最需要钱的人，即政府和小公司贷款。日本银行也有权利在不对自己、纳税人或社会大众造成任何成本的情况下，删除银行系统中的所有坏账。然而，他选择不采取行动。为什么呢？
It is natural to start with the incompetence hypothesis. Incompetence may indeed explain the actions of some of the actors in this drama. The Ministry of Finance, for instance, and the political leaders during the 1990s could have created a recovery simply by changing the way they funded their fiscal expenditure. Instead of borrowing from the public by issuing bonds, thus draining the money from the economy, they could have funded the public sector borrowing requirement by direct loan contracts from banks. When banks lend, they create money out of nothing, without withdrawing it from other parts of the economy. This way, fiscal policy would not have crowded out private sector activity yen by yen, as actually happened. Had they fully understood this, I am sure they would have used this method to create a recovery. However, this mechanism is little known among economists, whether in Japan, Europe, or the United States. Point 1.
从无能的假设开始是自然的。无能可能确实解释了这场戏中一些角色的行为，例如，财政部和90年代的政治领导人本可以通过改变他们的财政支出方式来创造复苏，他们本可以通过直接从银行借款来满足公共部门的借款需求，而不是通过发行债券从公众那里借款，从而把钱从经济中抽走。当银行贷款时，他们可以凭空创造出钱，而不需要从经济的其他部分提取。这样，财政政策就不会像实际发生的那样，一元一元地挤出私营部门的活动。如果他们完全理解了这一点，我相信他们一定会使用这种方法来创造复苏。然而，这种机制在日本、欧洲或美国的经济学家中鲜为人知。第一，
The more obvious and better-known mechanism is the one prescribed even by introductory economics textbooks. The central bank can inject money directly into the economy, even when banks are bankrupt, by increasing its purchases of assets. including government bonds, point to, yet the central bank has denied the truth of this fact for years out of incompetence. The deeper I researched into the issues and their history, the clearer it became that the leaders at the Bank of Japan have personally been very familiar with Japan's predicament and how to end it. In several previous recessions that were due to a credit crunch, such as the 1960s slump, the central bank increased lending to the corporate sector and the government. Also today, the central bank has many options available to achieve this. To name a few, it could purchase debt paper issued by firms, lend to the government, buy more bonds, buy real estate and turn it into public parks, or just print money and hand some to each citizen. In all cases, purchasing power would increase and demand would be stimulated. Printing money might also weaken the yen, which would help exports. Point 3. This would not produce inflation, since the very problem and cause of the recession is lack of money and hence deflation.
更明显和更为人所知的机制是初级经济学教科书甚至都会提到的，即使银行破产，中央银行也可以通过增加其资产购买，包括政府债券，直接向经济注入货币。然而，中央银行多年来一直否认这个事实的真实性，是因为无能吗？我对这些问题及其历史的研究越深入，就越清楚地看到，日本银行的领导人对日本的困境以及如何结束它非常熟悉。在几次由信贷紧缩引发的衰退中，如60年代的衰退，中央银行增加了对企业部门和政府的贷款。今天，中央银行也有许多可行的选项来实现这一点。举几个例子，它可以购买公司发行的债务证券，向政府贷款，购买更多的债券，购买房地产，并将其变为公园，或者只是印钱并分发给每个公民。在所有情况下，购买力都会增加，需求也会被刺激。印钱也可能会使日元贬值，这将有助于出口。三者不会产生通货膨胀，因为衰退的根本问题和原因就是货币不足，从而导致了通货紧缩。
An economic recovery could have been engineered at any time during the 1990s by increased central bank credit creation. Japan could have had high growth throughout the 1990s if the Bank of Japan had wished it to happen.
在90年代的任何时候，都可以通过增加中央银行的信贷创造来实现经济复苏。如果日本银行希望如此，日本在90年代就可以实现高增长。
All this is not rocket science. Moreover, today central bankers can look back on the rich history and experience of the Bank of Japan or other central banks that have dealt with the same issues, such as the German Central Bank or the U.S. Federal Reserve. So the puzzle remains, why did the Bank of Japan not create more money?
所有这些都不是火箭科学。此外，今天的中央银行家可以回顾日本银行或其他处理过同样问题的中央银行的丰富历史和经验，如德国中央银行或美国联邦储备银行。所以，谜团仍然存在，为什么日本银行没有创造更多的货币？
Concerning the motives of the players, there is little doubt that over the 1990s, the Ministry of Finance, just as the many governments that came and went, had every incentive to create an economic recovery. The ministry, in the firing line of fierce criticism, was painfully aware that a long recession endangered its legal predominance and that of the post-war economic structure. Upon closer examination, the motives of the central bank seem less clear.
关于玩家的动机，毫无疑问，在90年代，财政部就像许多来来去去的政府一样，都有创造经济复苏的动机。财政部在激烈的批评中处于前线，痛苦地意识到长期的衰退威胁到了其法律优势和战后经济结构。在仔细审查后，中央银行的动机似乎不那么清楚。
By 1992, when I was a visiting researcher at the Bank of Japan, I had discovered the importance of credit creation and its allocation. I realized that Japan's recession was going to get worse and unemployment was going to soar if the central bank did not implement the right policies. Interest rate reductions and fiscal policy were not sufficient. What was needed was more central bank money creation. But at the time, the central bank was doing the opposite, actively withdrawing money from the economy. I could not understand why and kept asking different members of the Bank of Japan to give me an answer. Finally, one particular central banker explained to me, if we printed more money, we would get a recovery. But then nothing would change. Japan's structural problems would not be solved. At the time, I could not believe his words. Would the Japanese central bank intentionally prolong the recession in order to change the economic structure? Would it be the job of the central bank to implement such economic and social change, especially change of such scale, at such economic and human cost, and in this opaque fashion? By 1998, suicides had reached a post-war high, many induced by the recession. Point 4.
到了1992年，当我在日本银行做访问研究员的时候，我发现了信贷创造及其分配的重要性。我意识到，如果中央银行不实施正确的政策，日本的经济衰退将会加剧，失业率也将飙升。仅仅降低利率和实施财政政策是不够的，我们需要的是更多的中央银行货币创造。但是当时中央银行正在做相反的事情，积极从经济中撤资。我无法理解为什么，一直在向日本银行的不同成员询问原因。最后，一位中央银行家向我解释说，如果我们印制更多的钱，我们就会恢复，但是什么都不会改变，日本的结构性问题不会得到解决。当时我无法相信他的话。日本中央银行会故意延长经济衰退以改变经济结构吗？实施这种经济和社会变革，尤其是如此大规模的变革，以如此大的经济和人力成本，以如此不透明的方式，会是中央银行的职责吗？到1998年，自杀率已经达到了战后的最高水平，很多都是由经济衰退引发的。
The Bank of Japan's official statements about its policy have been highly contradictory. On one hand, the central bank has insisted that the recession was due not to its policies but to the economic structure. That's why structural changes, not monetary stimulation, were necessary, as its officers never tire of repeating. Yet its staff, including its governor, have also said that they did not want to stimulate the economy, thus admitting that they could, because this would put off badly needed structural changes. Point 5. Central bank staff even argue that significant monetary easing could cause harm by inducing a further delay in the progress of structural adjustment. 6. Adam Posen, an economist at Washington's Institute for International Economics, has therefore concluded, between a process of elimination and careful reading of the statements of BOJ Policy Board members, I am led to the conclusion that a desire to promote structural change in the Japanese economy is a primary motivation for the bank's passive-aggressive acceptance of deflation. 7. If the reader is as skeptical as I was in the early 1990s, then this is a conclusion that is hard to accept.
日本银行关于其政策的官方声明一直充满矛盾。一方面，中央银行坚称经济衰退不是由于其政策，而是由于经济结构。这就是为什么需要结构性变革，而不是货币刺激，正如其官员们不厌其烦地重复的那样。然而，其员工，包括其行长，也表示他们不想刺激经济，从而承认他们可以这样做，因为这将推迟急需的结构性变革。中央银行的员工甚至认为，大幅度的货币宽松可能会造成伤害，因为它会进一步延迟结构调整的进程。华盛顿国际经济研究所的经济学家亚当·波森因此得出结论：通过排除法以及对日本银行政策委员会成员声明的仔细阅读，我得出的结论是，推动日本经济结构变革的愿望是日本银行被动接受通货紧缩的主要动机。如果读者像我在90年代初那样怀疑，那么这个结论就很难接受。
The rise of the Bank of Japan.
日本银行的崛起。
If a recovery would prevent structural changes, then this means that structural changes are not necessary for a recovery. So why are structural changes needed? While the Japanese system has had many problems and there is room for improvement, especially when it comes to increasing the quality of life, the size of houses, leisure time available, the number of parks, and so on, it is not clear that a U.S.-style economic system will significantly improve living standards. A U.S.-style economic system also has disadvantages. The Japanese economic system had many positive aspects that could have been preserved if a public debate had occurred about the structural change agenda.
如果经济复苏会阻止结构性变化，那么这就意味着结构性变化并不是经济复苏所必须的。那么，为什么需要结构性变化呢？虽然日本的体系存在许多问题，有改进的空间，尤其是在提高生活质量、房屋大小、可用的休闲时间、公园数量等方面，但并不清楚美国式的经济体系是否会显著提高生活水平。美国式的经济体系也有其缺点。日本的经济体系有许多积极的方面，如果对结构变革议程进行公开辩论，这些方面本可以得以保留。
The fact is that the recession of the 1990s has indeed triggered a structural transformation that many experts refer to as remarkable. 8. The structural and administrative reforms of the 1990s did not just create losers. While former Okarasho bureaucrats may have been close to tears on New Year's Eve 2000, the champagne corks were perhaps popping elsewhere. When the Okarasho was scrapped, its tasks had already been either abolished or reassigned to other agencies. In 1998, monetary policy was put into the hands of the newly independent Bank of Japan, and regulation of the financial sector was put into the hands of the Independent Financial Services Agency, FSA. Since many of the influential FSA staff hailed from the central bank, a clear winner had emerged from the administrative reshuffling. 9. That was none other than the Bank of Japan, MOF's long-standing rival. It had finally triumphed and was now more powerful than ever before.
事实上，20世纪90年代的经济衰退确实引发了一场许多专家称之为显著的结构转型。90年代的结构和行政改革并非只有输家。虽然前财务省的官僚们可能在2000年新年前夕快要哭出来，但在其他地方可能正在热烈庆祝。当财务省被废除时，其任务已经被废除或重新分配给其他机构。1998年，货币政策被交给了新独立的日本银行，金融部门的监管被交给了独立的金融服务机构 FSA。由于许多有影响力的 FSA 员工来自中央银行，行政重组的明显赢家已经出现，那就是日本银行财务省的长期竞争对手。他最终取得了胜利，现在比以往任何时候都更强大。
Despite the ministry's dominant legal status, the central bank had the better cards. It was in charge of a little-known and extra-legal credit control mechanism. Hiding behind the smokescreen of traditional interest rate policies, its decision-makers remained entirely unaccountable. All this was possible because of a lack of transparency and a lack of meaningful accountability by the central bank for its monetary policy.
尽管财务省在法律地位上占主导地位，但中央银行却拥有更好的牌。它掌管着一个鲜为人知且超出法律控制的信贷控制机制。在传统的利率政策的烟雾幕后，其决策者完全不负责任。所有这一切都是因为中央银行的货币政策缺乏透明度和有意义的问责制。
Central bank independence.
央行独立性。
The new Bank of Japan law was proposed in 1997 as part of Prime Minister Hashimoto's administrative reform program. At the time, the financial press argued that the new law merely meant a slight increase in autonomy for the Bank of Japan. 10. The deputy governor of the Bank of Japan at the time, Toshihiko Fukui, lobbied press and politicians and argued that the new Bank of Japan law would allow the bank to make monetary decisions faster and more flexibly, and help it gain more credibility from the financial markets. 11.
新的日本银行法案在1997年作为首相 Hashimoto 的行政改革计划的一部分提出。当时，金融媒体认为新法案只意味着日本银行的自主性略有增加。当时的日本银行副行长福井俊彦向媒体和政界人士游说，声称新的日本银行法案将使银行能够更快、更灵活地做出货币决策，并帮助其在金融市场上获得更多的信誉。11.
This is not what happened, just as I had feared in 1997 when the new law was being debated. By that time, I had done enough research to become convinced that the new BOJ law was against the interests of the Japanese people, and by example also a threat to democracies in other countries. So I did my best to stop its passage. I faxed a letter to as many parliamentarians as I could. I also tried to arrange meetings with the members of the relevant parliamentary committees. Many ignored my faxes and phone calls, but a substantial number did take the time to see me and hear what I had to tell them. But it was an uphill battle. Just as I had thought myself before my years of research on the Bank of Japan, most experts also felt that central bank independence was a good thing. We will see later in this book that the arguments in favor of central bank independence, whether in Europe or Asia, have serious flaws. This includes the argument that the German Bundesbank's great success was based on its independence. The truth, as we shall see, was quite the opposite.
然而，事实并非如此。正如我在1997年新法案被讨论时所担心的那样，到那时，我已经做了足够的研究，确信新的日本银行法案不符合日本人民的利益，也对其他国家的民主构成威胁。因此，我尽我所能阻止其通过。 我向尽可能多的议员发送了传真。我还试图安排与相关议会委员会成员的会面。许多人忽视了我的传真和电话，但还是有相当多的人愿意花时间见我，听我说出我要告诉他们的事情。但这是一场艰难的战斗。就像我在研究日本银行多年之前的想法一样，大多数专家也认为央行独立是一件好事。我们将在本书后面看到支持央行独立的论点，无论是在欧洲还是亚洲，都存在严重的缺陷。这包括德国联邦银行的巨大成功是基于其独立性的论点。然而，事实恰恰相反，我们将看到
The new Bank of Japan law was passed, and that is why today the government has no more control over monetary policy. After the stock market falls of 2001 and 2002, many politicians called for the resignation of the BOJ governor. Mr. Hayami responded to such criticism by demanding that Japanese people give up lifetime employment and face less job security. His own job security was assured. There was nothing the government could do to sack him. Under the new Bank of Japan law, he was not doing anything wrong, because it does not clearly state that it is the job of the central bank to achieve healthy economic growth.
新的日本银行法案被通过了。这就是为什么今天政府对货币政策已经无法控制。在2001年和2002年的股市下跌之后，许多政治家呼吁日本银行行长辞职。对于这样的批评，早见先生的回应是要求日本人放弃终身雇佣，面对更少的工作保障。他自己的工作保障是有保证的，政府无法解雇他。根据新的日本银行法，他没有做错任何事，因为该法并没有明确规定央行的职责是实现健康的经济增长。
There is no mechanism for politicians to exert their will, except changing the central bank law again. It is not the government but the BOJ that decides whether we will have a boom or a recession.
政治家们除了再次修改央行法案外，没有其他机制来施加他们的意愿。决定我们是否会有繁荣或衰退的，不是政府，而是日本银行。
Just who are the central bankers?
究竟谁是央行家？
While the central bankers are good at keeping a low profile, their career paths tend to be more predictable than those of ordinary citizens or politicians. Few people would venture to guess who the next finance minister is going to be or how long the current prime minister will last. During the post-war era, there has been no such uncertainty about the top job at the Bank of Japan.
虽然中央银行家擅长保持低调，但他们的职业道路往往比普通公民或政治家的更为可预测。很少有人会冒险猜测下一任财政部长会是谁，或者现任首相会持续多久。在战后时期，日本银行的最高职位没有这样的不确定性。
Japan has had 26 prime ministers in the 58 years since the war. However, a much smaller number of people have been in control of Japan's money and hence the heart of its economy. Known as princes by their colleagues, they were the men behind the Bank of Japan. Like the puppeteers of Japanese bunraku, dressed in black and moving in the background, these little-known central bankers shaped key events in Japan's post-war history. Politicians, governments, and bureaucrats, even the mighty Ministry of Finance, became unwitting puppets in their money game. Yet until now, very little has been known about them and their policy tools. I hope this book will shed some light on their activities and make the reader more aware of the power wielded by unelected central bankers.
战后58年来，日本已经更换了26位首相。然而，掌控日本货币，从而掌控其经济核心的人数要少得多。他们被同事们称为王子，他们是日本银行背后的男人。就像日本文乐的操纵师，他们身着黑衣，在幕后移动。这些鲜为人知的中央银行家塑造了日本战后历史的关键事件。政治家、政府和官僚，甚至强大的财政部，在他们的货币游戏中成为了无意识的傀儡。然而，直到现在，我们对他们和他们的政策工具知之甚少。我希望这本书能揭示他们的活动，让读者更加了解这些未经选举的中央银行家的权利。
Even today, a large number of journalists and commentators seem quite sure about who is going to be the next Bank of Japan governor. In May 2001, in the same week this book was published in Japanese, Toshihiko Fukui, head of the Fujitsu Research Institute, staged an attempt to take over from Governor Hayami as the new governor. The media had been touting Fukui as an impressive candidate, the leading contender in the running for the BOJ governorship, and in line for the top job. 12. The Nikkei, Japan's leading financial newspaper, prematurely introduced him on its cover page with a photo as the new governor. In the event, Governor Hayami refused to resign. However, his 5-year term ends in March 2003. Until December last year, despite other plausible candidates, the media agreed on the likeliest successor, Toshihiko Fukui, called the compromise candidate at the top of the list by the Financial Times. Why? He is an effective leader, capable of steering the BOJ through the murky waters that lie ahead. 13.
即使在今天，仍有大量的记者和评论员对谁将成为下一任日本银行行长非常确定。2001年5月，就在这本书以日文出版的同一周，富士通研究所的负责人福井俊彦试图接替现任行长宿水健朗成为新的行长。媒体一直将福井塑造为一位令人印象深刻的候选人，他是竞选日本银行行长的领先者，并且排在首位。12日本领先的财经报纸日经新闻在封面上提前以照片的形式介绍他为新的行长。然而，宿水健朗拒绝辞职。然而，他的5年任期将于2003年3月结束。直到去年12月，尽管有其他合理的候选人，媒体都认为最有可能的继任者是福井俊彦，他被《金融时报》称为名单上的妥协候选人。为什么？他是一位有效的领导者，有能力引导日本银行穿越前方的暗流。13.
In actual fact, in post-war history, there has been little compromise in the selection of the true heads of the Bank of Japan. The same unanimous case was made by the media and well-informed observers before Yasushi Mino became governor in 1989, and 10 years before that, when Haruo Maekawa became governor. Again, 10 years earlier, the insiders knew that Tadashi Sasaki would become governor. We find in this book that Fukui, Mino, Maekawa, and Sasaki have many things in common. The least of those is that they were at the helm of the central bank for 10 years each, and they all played a leading role in the Japan Association of Corporate Executives, Kizei Doyakai, which has argued since the 1970s that Japan should radically change its economic structure. More ominously, all of them had been known as princes since their youthful early years at the central bank, the anointed future heads of the Bank of Japan. It was an epithet that was not awarded lightly. Only one central banker per decade could become a prince.
实际上，在战后历史中，选择日本银行真正的领导者几乎没有妥协。在1989年三重野康成为行长，以及在此之前10年，前行长前川春夫上任之前，媒体和知情观察者都有同样的一致看法。再往前10年，内部人士知道佐佐木正会成为行长。我们在这本书中发现，福井、三重野、前川和佐佐木有许多共同之处。最不重要的是，他们都在中央银行掌舵10年，他们都在日本企业家协会、经济同友会中发挥了领导作用。该协会自1970年代以来一直主张日本应彻底改变其经济结构。更令人不安的是，他们在中央银行的早年青年时期就被称为王子，被指定为日本银行未来的领导者。这个称号并不是轻易给出的，每10年只有一位中央银行家可以成为王子。
In its earlier Japanese version, this book contributed to an increasing awareness by the Japanese public about these princes, their goals, and their way of implementing their policies, including Fukui's pivotal role in the events that led to the creation of the financial bubble of the 1980s and the decade-long period of underperformance in the 1990s. Moreover, more politicians appear to understand that the Bank of Japan has been the main culprit behind the Japanese malaise and that a more supportive policy by the central bank is a necessary condition for an economic recovery. Perhaps as a result, Prime Minister Kazumi stated in late December 2002 that he would appoint as governor of the Bank of Japan only someone who is aggressive in fighting deflation. 14. This should effectively have ruled out Prince Fukui as contender. Not only his past actions but also his recent statements seem to indicate that he is unwilling to fight deflation. 15. To the contrary, he demanded that more companies should be bankrupted and that Japan's unemployment rate should rise further to at least 8%. 16. But what is said is not always what is done.
这本书的早期日文版本提高了日本公众对这些王子们、他们的目标以及他们实施政策的方式的认识， 包括辅警在导致1980年代金融泡沫产生和1990年代长达10年的低效期间的关键角色。此外，更多的政治家似乎开始理解，日本银行一直是日本经济困境的主要罪魁祸首，中央银行更支持性的政策是经济复苏的必要条件。也许因此，小泉纯一郎首相在2002年12月底表示，他将任命一位积极对抗通货紧缩的人作为日本银行的行长。这应该有效地排除了王子辅警作为竞争者。不仅他过去的行动，而且他最近的声明似乎都表明他不愿意对抗通货紧缩。相反，他要求更多的公司应该破产，日本的失业率应该进一步上升至至少 8%。但是说的并不总是做的。
If an outsider had been appointed as new Bank of Japan governor, in place of Fukui, the old guard at the Bank of Japan would likely have resorted to a well-tried method of staying in charge in such cases. We will see in this book that whenever a former finance ministry official or an outsider from the private sector became Bank of Japan governor, he would be kept in the dark about the allegedly technical details of the actual monetary policy implementation, namely the quantity of the central bank's credit creation. These were decided by the deputy governor, one of the princes, who would after 5 years become official governor.
如果一位局外人被任命为新的日本银行行长，取代辅警，日本银行的老派人物可能会采用一种久经考验的方法来在这种情况下保持掌控。我们将在这本书中看到，每当一位前财政部官员或私营部门的局外人成为日本银行行长时，他都会被对实际货币政策实施的所谓的技术性细节保持在黑暗中，及中央银行的信贷创造的数量。这些都是由副行长，也就是其中一位王子决定的，他将在5年后成为正式的行长。
During the first 5 years, the official governor would have control over the minor policy tools of interest rates and banks' reserves with the central bank, while the old guard would remain in charge through their control over the quantity of credit.
在最初的5年里，官方行长将对利率和银行在央行的储备这些次要的政策工具拥有控制权，而老派人士则通过控制信贷数量保持其主导地位。
In the event, Toshihiko Fukui once again made the race, just as had been planned 35 years ago. Back in 2000, when I was finishing the Japanese version of this book, I predicted that he would become the next governor of the Bank of Japan. The fact that he was duly appointed, despite contrary statements by the Prime Minister and by an administration famous for surprise appointments, merely serves to demonstrate the extent of the power wielded by the princes.
事实上，就像35年前计划的那样，福井俊彦再次参与了竞选。在2000年，当我完成这本书的日文版时，我预测他将成为日本银行的下一任行长。尽管首相和以出人意料的任命而著名的政府都发表了相反的声明，他仍然被正式任命，这只是证明了王子们掌握的权力有多大。
Public debate is needed.
需要公开辩论。
Nobody knows better than Prince Fukui that the introduction of an inflation target, now thought to be favored by the Prime Minister, is also not itself a solution. He knows that what is needed are policies to expand credit creation. Instead, just like the Reichsbank during the Weimar Republic, the Bank of Japan has been implementing inappropriate credit policies that go significantly beyond the call of duty without the necessary accountability. There is a danger that the European Central Bank and the U.S. Federal Reserve are following in the footsteps of these central banks.
没有人比福井王子更清楚，现在被认为首相所倾向的引入通胀目标本身并不是解决方案。他知道需要的是扩大信贷创造的政策。相反，就像魏玛共和国时期的德国国家银行一样，日本银行一直在实施超出职责要求的不适当的信贷政策，而没有必要的问责制度。欧洲中央银行和美国联邦储备系统可能正在追随这些中央银行的脚步，这存在危险。
Even central bankers are human. As such, they are as prone to errors and acts of selfishness as anyone else. What they need is the right incentive structure to limit these tendencies, namely, democratic checks and balances. Implementing such checks does not mean that money should be debauched and inflation allowed. To the contrary, history teaches that the only guarantor of stable money is accountability of a central bank that has been given the right policy goals.
即使是中央银行家也是人，因此， 他们和其他人一样，容易犯错误和做出自私的行为。他们需要的是正确的激励结构来限制这些倾向，也就是说，需要民主的制衡。实施这种制衡并不意味着应该贬低货币和允许通胀。相反，历史教导我们，稳定货币的唯一保证是被赋予正确政策目标的中央银行的问责制。
A broader debate about the correct role of central banks in democracies is necessary. Any such debate must be based on knowledge of the facts and the history of central banking. This includes the realization that central banks often may use interest rates as a smokescreen to distract others from their true policies, which usually can be judged better when measuring the quantity of credit.
关于中央银行在民主社会中正确角色的更广泛的辩论是必要的。任何此类辩论都必须基于对事实和中央银行历史的了解。这包括认识到中央银行经常可能使用利率作为烟幕，以转移他人对其真实政策的注意力，而这些政策通常可以通过衡量信贷数量来更好地判断。
I am happy to report that my book has made a modest contribution to this effort. The Japanese version was published with a print run of 150,000 copies, becoming a #1 bestseller. Many members of parliament read it. Several LDP members took it to heart and established the LDP Central Bank Reform Research Group. I hope the English edition will contribute to the stimulation of such debate also in other countries.
我很高兴地报告，我的书对这项工作做出了一定的贡献。日本版的发行量达到了15万本，成为了畅销书排行榜的第1名。许多国会议员都阅读了它。一些自民党成员深受其影响，成立了自民党中央银行改革研究小组。我希望英文版也能在其他国家激发此类辩论。
Tokyo, February 28, 2003.
2003年2月28日，东京。
Richard A. Werner.
理查德 ·A. 沃纳。
Acknowledgements.
致谢。
During the past decade of research, I was blessed to receive the support, encouragement, guidance, and advice of many people, without whom this book would not have been completed. It all started with Bori Minikovic at the hospitable Linacre College, Oxford, who urged me to write it. When he did so, in 1991, I believe he anticipated completion at an earlier date. And so did my family and friends, who had to listen to my talk about it for far too long. My thanks go to them, especially my parents, Dr. Med Gunnar H. Werner and Walfried Francisca Werner, and my parents-in-law, T. John Cook and N. Cook, for their support and patience, and of course my wife, Romy, for her tireless active support and advice. Along the way the research took me, I was helped by and learned from many teachers, mentors, colleagues, and fellow students of Japan and economics, as well as many honest and upright central bankers. It is a long list, which makes it hard to mention all of them. At the same time, some wish to remain anonymous. My thanks go to the unnamed, as well as to Robert Aliber, Aljabinka Anik, Yukihiro Asano, Daniel Baburek, John Baldwin, Benjamin Buchan, Kenneth Cordes, Clive Crook, Lord Magnod Desai, Nicholas Dimsdale, Eamon Fingleton, Daniela Fraubos, James Gordon, Junichi Hirano, Akiyoshi Horiuchi, Tim Jenkinson, Chalmers Johnson, Jennifer Josephi, Keimei Kizuka, Kazuo Kanamori, Masao Kays, Richard Koo, Arami Kurai, C. H. Kwan, Prince Max von Liechtenstein, Claudia Maas, Junko Matsubara, Paul McNellis, William Miller, Masao Miyamoto, Stephen Nickel, Tetsuya Noguchi, Yukio Noguchi, Kazuhiko Ogata, Hirohiko Okamura, Takashi Ashio, Gonri, Florentino Rodao, Keiko Sakai, Riaz Osato, Junzo Sawa, Christopher Scott, Elisa Shum, Nicholas Stern, Paul Somerville, Rico Toma, Karel Van Wolfren, Peter Warburton, Kozo Yamamura, Riko Yoshida, Naoyuki Yoshino, the friendly staff of the former Japan Development Bank, the helpful staff I met at the Nomura Research Institute, the many honest staff of the Bank of Japan, and who had best remain unnamed, the members of the Ministry of Finance's Research Institute, Nobumitsu Kagami, Declan Hayes, and my other supportive colleagues at Sophia University, my teachers and friends at Oxford University, my former colleagues at Jardine Fleming Securities, the Reverend David Kim, and my friends at Tokyo Shibuya Harvest, the past and present team of the Profit Research Center and Profit Fund Com AG, namely Jenny Alf, Chris Baffa, Rosemary Cook, Nicola Diaz, Ortwin Gyerhake, Kiyoshi Goga, Yuki Goga, Taimir Katarchief, Count Magnus Lagergren, Yoko Minami, Makoto Nagamori, Aoi Sakamoto, Nasuyoshi Seiki, Yuriko Suzuki, Tomonori Tani, Michael Thon, Ronald Werner, Shuji Yamada, as well as Prince Michael von Liechtenstein, Albert Mayer, Matthias and Martina Voigt, Manuela Ulmer, and Christine Erhardt.
在过去的10年研究中，我有幸得到了许多人的支持、鼓励、指导和建议。没有他们，这本书就无法完成。一切都始于热情好客的林克尔学院的 Boris Minakovic， 他鼓励我写这本书。当他在1991年这样做时，我相信他预期的完成日期会更早。我的家人和朋友也是如此，他们不得不听我谈论这本书的时间过于漫长。我要感谢他们，特别是我的父母 Dear Matt、Gunter H. Werner 和 Wolfried Francisca Werner， 以及我的岳父母 T. John Cook 和 Ann Cook， 他们的支持和耐心，当然还有我的妻子 Romy， 她的积极支持和建议。在研究的过程中，我得到了许多老师、导师、同事和日本经济学的同学们的帮助和教诲，以及许多诚实正直的中央银行家。这是一个很长的名单，很难提到他们所有人。同时，有些人希望保持匿名。我要感谢那些未被提及的人，以及 Robert Alber、Jubinka Anik、Yukihiro Asano、Daniel Baburek、John Baldwin、Benjamin Buchan、Kenneth Cordes、Clive Crook、Lord Magnat Dasai、Nicholas Dimsdale、Eamon Fingleton、Daniela Fraubos、James Gordon、Junichi Hirano、Akiyoshi Horiuchi、Tim Jenkinson、Chalmers Johnson、Jennifer Josephi、Keime Keizuka、Kazuo Kanamori、Masao Case、Richard Koo、Arami Korai、C.H. Kwan、Prince Max von Liechtenstein、Claudia Maas、Junko Matsubara、Paul McNellis、William Miller、Masao Miyamoto、Stephen Nicol、Tetsuya Noguchi、Yukio Noguchi、Kazuhiko Ogata、Hirohiko Okumura、Takashi Yoshio、Gon Ri、Florentino Rodal、Keiko Sakai、Ryozo Sato、Junzo Sawa、Christopher Stott、Elisa Sheng、Nicholas Stern、Paul Somerville、Rico Toma、Karel van Wolfram、Peter Warburton、Kozo Yamamura、Rico Yoshida、Naoyuki Yoshino， 以及前日本开发银行的友好员工，我在野村研究所遇到的乐于助人的员工，许多诚实的日本银行的员工，最好保持匿名，财政部研究所的成员 Nobumitsu Kagami、Dylan Hayes， 以及在上智大学支持我的其他同事，我在牛津大学的老师和朋友，我在 Jardine Fleming Securities 的前同事 Reverend David Kim 和我在东京涩谷 Harvest 的朋友 Profit Research Center 和 Profit Fund Com-AG 的过去和现在的团队，及 Jenny Elf、Chris Baffa、Rosemary Cook、Nicola Diaz、Ortwin Gyerhake、Kiyoshi Goga、Yuki Goga、Taihamir Katarjiv、Count Magnus Lagergren、Yoko Minami、Makoto Nagamori、Aoi Sakamoto、Yasuyoshi Seiki、Yuriko Suzuki、Tomonori Tani、Michael Thon、Ronald Werner、Shuji Yamada， 以及 Prince Michael von Liechtenstein、Albert Mayer、Matthias 和 Martina Voigt、Manuela Ulmer 和 Christine Erhardt。
In addition, I would like to thank the many conscientious members of the Japanese and international media who have listened to me and covered my findings over the past decade.
此外，我还要感谢过去10年来倾听我并报道我的研究成果的日本和国际媒体的许多尽职尽责的成员。
My special thanks go to Mark Metzler and my wife, Romy, for taking it upon themselves to read the entire typescript, make many suggestions for improvement, and save me from errors. I would also like to thank my editor Patricia Liu, as well as Angela Piliuras, Sue Warga, and their colleagues at M.E. Sharp for their professional guidance and great enthusiasm for this project. While all the remaining errors are mine, all the credit is due to the Lord, who is my light. Psalm 27 verse 1.
我特别感谢 Mark Metzler 和我的妻子 Romy， 他们自愿阅读整个手稿，提出许多改进建议，帮我避免错误。我还要感谢我的编辑 Patricia Liu 以及 Angela Piliuras、Sue Warga 和他们在 M.E. Sharp 的同事们，他们对这个项目的专业指导和极大的热情。虽然所有剩下的错误都是我的，但所有的荣誉都归于我的光明之主。诗篇27:1。
Finally, I would like to acknowledge permission to reproduce parts of earlier publications from the copyright holders, especially M.E. Sharp, the East Asian Economic Association, and Blackwell Publishers Limited, and gratefully acknowledge financial research support received over the past 12 years, mainly from the British Economic and Social Research Council, and thus the British taxpayer. The Krupp Foundation under the vigorous leadership of Berthold Beetz, the Citigroup Foundation, the Japanese Ministry of Education, the Japan Foundation, and thus the Japanese taxpayer, the European Commission, and hence the taxpayers in the net contributing countries, the Asian Development Bank, and the Profit Research Center Limited, Tokyo, and thus its clients all over the world.
最后，我想感谢版权持有者，特别是 M.E. Sharp 东亚经济协会和 Blackwell 出版社有限公司，允许我复制早期出版物的部分内容。我也非常感谢在过去的12年里，主要来自英国经济和社会研究委员会，因此是英国纳税人，在 Berthold Beetz 积极领导下的克鲁普基金会、花旗集团基金会、日本教育部、日本基金会，因此是日本纳税人，欧洲委员会，因此是净贡献国的纳税人，亚洲开发银行，以及位于东京的 Profit Research Center 有限公司，因此是全球的客户所提供的财务研究支持。
RW. Acronyms and abbreviations.
缩略词和缩写。
APEC. Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation.
APEC 亚太经济合作组织。
BIPF. Bangkok International Banking Facility.
BIBF 曼谷国际银行设施。
BS. Bank for International Settlements.
BIS 国际结算银行。
BOJ. Bank of Japan.
日本银行 BOJ。
CP. Commercial Paper.
商业票据 CP。
CPI. Consumer Price Index.
消费者价格指数 CPI。
ECB. European Central Bank.
欧洲中央银行 ECB。
EMEB. Executives Meeting of East Asia, Pacific Central Banks.
东亚太平洋中央银行行长会议 EMI。
EMI. European Monetary Institute.
欧洲货币协会 EMI。
EMS. European Monetary System.
EMS 欧洲货币体系。
EMU. European Monetary Union.
EMU 欧洲货币联盟。
ESB. Economic Stabilization Board.
ESB 经济稳定委员会。
ESCB. European System of Central Banks.
ESCB 欧洲中央银行体系。
EU. European Union.
EU 欧洲联盟。
FDI. Foreign Direct Investment.
FDI 外商直接投资。
FILP. Fiscal Investment and Loan Program.
FILP 财政投资和贷款计划。
FSA. Financial Services Agency.
FSA 金融服务局。
FY. Fiscal Year.
FY 财政年度。
GATT. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
GATT 关税和贸易总协定。
GDP. Gross Domestic Product.
GDP 国内生产总值。
GHQ. General Headquarters of SCAP.
GHQ 最高司令部 SCAP。
GNP. Gross National Product.
GNP 国民生产总值。
IBJ. Industrial Bank of Japan.
IBJ 日本产业银行。
IMF. International Monetary Fund.
IMF 国际货币基金组织。
JGBs. Japanese Government Bonds.
JGBs 日本政府债券。
JDB. Japan Development Bank, now Development Bank of Japan.
JDB 日本开发银行，现为日本政策投资银行。
LDP. Liberal Democratic Party of Japan.
LDP 日本自由民主党。
LTCB. Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan.
日本长期信用银行 LTCB。
LTCM. Long-Term Capital Management.
长期资本管理 LTCM。
MEDI. Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, formerly MEDI.
经济产业省，原名 METI。
MIDI. Ministry of International Trade and Industry.
国际贸易和工业部 MITI。
MOF. Ministry of Finance.
财政部 MOF。
NCB. Nippon Credit Bank.
日本信贷银行 NCB。
NSAP. National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei.
NSDAP 国家社会主义德国工人党。
OECD. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
OECD 经济合作与发展组织。
SCAP. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers.
SCAP 盟军最高司令部。
WBI. Wholesale Price Index.
WPI 批发价格指数。
WTO, World Trade Organization.
WTO 世界贸易组织。
YOY, year on year.
月同比。
Note on the representation of personal names. The ordering of first names and surnames follows the conventions of the English language.
关于个人姓名的表示注释，名字和姓氏的排列顺序遵循英语的惯例。